Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah from Mormons. Today we're doing 2 Nephi 24, which is Isaiah 14. Unfortunately, this is the last chapter of Isaiah that we get in the Book of Mormon in this big chunk of Isaiah that we've gotten. We'll have scattered chapters here and there, and actually quite a few references to Isaiah, which are useful because we get some explanation about them in the Book of Mormon, which gives us an ancient interpretation of Isaiah, which is, of course, always what we want. But this, unfortunately, is the last chapter in the big section of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. After this, we kind of have to go it alone. I'll be using the Dead Sea Scrolls and the standard Masoretic text, which is the basis of the King James Version, and also the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation. I'll just kind of have those in front of me, comparing them as I'm doing it. I haven't really had to do that so far. Between the Book of Mormon and the standard Hebrew and the Masoretic text, we have everything we need. The Book of Mormon obviously is the best, oldest version we have, so we can just periodically turn to the Hebrew for interesting details. After this, it becomes a little bit more difficult. We have to try to reconstruct the best text based on the three versions that we have, because none of them are clearly superior like the Book of Mormon. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls version is old, but not nearly as old as the Book of Mormon, literally hundreds of years later. And by hundreds of years, I mean about half a millennium later. Yeah, it's that bad. So it's kind of painful for me, but that's just what we have to do. So after this, we unfortunately will not be able to use much of the Book of Mormon anymore. Scattered chapters, obviously Isaiah 52 and 53 is in the Book of Mormon, and a few others like that, but unfortunately we'll kind of have to go it alone after this. So this is the last chapter where we can just enjoy the use of the Book of Mormon. At least of this big chunk here. So to just jump into chapter 24 of 2 Nephi, Isaiah 14, you have to remember the context here. In chapter 23, he's been talking about Babylon and the destruction of Babylon and what's going to happen to them. And there's an interesting detail that he adds, and I'll just read that to remind you of it. It says, "And the wild beasts of the island shall cry on their desolate houses," after the Babylonians have been destroyed. These little animals are going to inhabit all the places that used to be their pleasant little houses, right? "And dragons in their pleasant palaces." Okay, so all these wild animals are going to overrun what used to be these lovely cities. "And her time is near to come, and her days shall not be prolonged. For I will destroy her speedily, yea, for I will be merciful unto my people, but the wicked shall perish." Now, that last sentence, "I will destroy her speedily, yea, for I will be merciful unto my people, but the wicked shall perish," is an addition that we only find in the Book of Mormon. That's an original element of the text that was removed that we don't have in any other versions. And then but it ties it to chapter 24, Isaiah 14. It says, "For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land, and the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob." So it says, "I'll be merciful unto my people." How is he merciful unto his people? Well, we see it in chapter 24. That he will yet choose Israel and will return them to their own land. And they won't be alone. Strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. So this kind of helps to bridge Isaiah 13 and 14, which are actually one cohesive unit. Isaiah 13:1 all the way through chapter 14, most of chapter 14, is one cohesive unit, a speech given against Babylon. There's a little tiny few verse snippet of something else that we don't have the context for at the end of chapter 14 that's just inserted there because, frankly, I don't think they knew where else to put it. Although it does thematically tie in. It may not chronologically. And like I said, this would be a little snippet of something else, but that was put in at the end. Interestingly, however, the Book of Mormon ends with that. It includes that little snippet. So thematically, they at least see it being tied. And I think that's very fair for them to include it, because really I do think it's thematically tied. Once again, this is not chronological. This is all thematical. They've jumped from chapter 12. You remember the sort of rehashing of the Song of the Sea. to chapters 13 and most of 14, we've jumped to a huge amount of time. This sermon, 13 and most of 14, was given the year King Ahaz died. So, not the year King Uzziah died, that's chapter 6. Lots of crazy chronological markers. This is chapter 14. So this sermon, 13 and most of 14, was given the year King Ahaz died. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It actually ends up being right on the money as far as the prediction that he makes, not surprisingly. But that's really what we're looking at here, is this long speech, all of 13, most of 14, and then a little snippet at the end of 14, which in some ways, like I said, it probably is not part of this, but it really does thematically wrap up some of the stuff about Babylon, which is probably why the Book of Mormon authors choose to end their large quotations there, as he starts right at the beginning of what was Isaiah at the time, before the later introduction was put on, which is now chapter 1, and then just keeps reading until he gets to what would be our chapter 15, which is talking about Moab, and it's not terribly relevant to them anymore. It's really Babylon that's the issue, because Babylon is just about to totally destroy everything, so it's very, very relevant for them, whereas Moab, they don't really have to deal much with Moab. It's not terribly relevant to them, so they probably just stop there, where it kind of ceases to be as relevant. So anyway, let's just jump right in here to chapter 24 and just talk about this speech as a whole and explain really what Isaiah is talking about in this chapter. So here in 2 Nephi 24:1, it says, "For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land, and the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. And the people shall take them and bring them to their place, yea, from far unto the ends of the earth, and they shall return to their lands of promise. And the house of Israel shall possess them, and the land of the Lord shall be for servants and handmaids, and they shall take them captives unto whom they were captives, and they shall rule over their oppressors. And it shall come to pass in that day, the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow and from thy fear, and from the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve. And it shall come to pass in that day that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say, How hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. The Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked, the scepters of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and none hindereth." This is quite the chapter. Isaiah is really laying into the king of Babylon, and I just love it. Just love it when he does this. And he's been doing this the whole time. He picks whoever he wants, and then he just lambasts them. And I think the reason that he does it is because he doesn't really care who you are or where you're from. He just can't stand arrogance. And God kind of stirs him up, I think, to speak out against arrogance wherever he finds it, and he definitely does that here. So in verse 1, though, it's kind of different. It's interesting how he weaves these themes together. So in verse 1 he says, "For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land. And the stranger shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob." So you have to understand, this is some time later. This is the year King Ahaz dies. King Ahaz dies probably in 716 BC. So it would have been a really big deal for Isaiah to be talking about these things, because it's during this period that you have some of the major issues that you have with the kingdom of Israel. Israel is getting taken away into captivity, and so he's having to deal with this. You have to remember that, so this is 716, like I said, 716 BC, and it's only been a very short time since the kingdom of Israel was taken away. But not all of Israel was taken away. We think of the king of Assyria just coming in and taking everybody away, but that's not completely true. There were a bunch of refugees who kind of saw the handwriting on the wall, as it were, and they fled to the south. Like I talked about earlier, there's so many of these refugees. Hezekiah, taking up Isaiah's thoughts about taking care of the poor, builds an extra wall around, making Jerusalem bigger, adding this extra walled section for these refugees to protect them from the incoming attack of the Assyrians. So, um, yeah, so you have to remember that Isaiah's audience has subtly changed, rather suddenly, and that's happened because you have all these refugees who are coming down, and now he's talking to them. So when he is talking about people returning to their own land, that's a big deal for his audience. Many of whom, number one, are hoping to maybe return to their own lands. Number two, they all have friends and family who got taken away by the Assyrians, and they're hoping that their family members and their friends can return to their own lands and that they can be united. And so Isaiah is saying that is going to happen, although when you read this chapter you realize he's not talking about something that's going to happen immediately. It's going to take a while. But he says, the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land. But once again, why would he say Israel? Jacob is one of the two names of the man we know as Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Israel is the other name. So he uses both names here. And why Israel? I think this is a double meaning, because Israel's been taken away to Assyria, the 10 tribes of Israel. But he's saying that Israel is going to return to their own land someday. But once again, he's kind of mixed things up. He says, the Lord will have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land, and the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. So when they come back, they're not going to come back alone. They're going to come back with a bunch of people that have joined with them. The idea being, I think, that the worship of Jehovah is going to be so attractive, many people are going to come back and be there with them, which is actually exactly what happened when the Samaritans come in. They do worship Jehovah as a way of fending off lions, and that's a funny story. You should look that up sometime. And they mix together and become this new nation. So literally, these strangers, people, foreigners, are joined with them, and they cleave to the house of Jacob. And I think that's very interesting. So then he proceeds. He says, the people shall take them and bring them to their place, yea, from far unto the ends of the earth. Now, this is an addition. This is something that we get in the Book of Mormon that we don't get in other places, from far unto the ends of the earth. And they shall return to their lands of promise, and the house of Israel shall possess them. So, yeah, this is a little bit different. We see that this is not, maybe not just them talking about the Assyrian captivity. Maybe he also has other things on his mind, as usual. Now, obviously, his immediate audience is concerned about the Assyrian captivity, but he can't help but allude here, I think, to other issues that are going to happen in the future. So it says, the people will take them and bring them to their place, yea, from far unto the ends of the earth. Now, literally, when we do missionary work today, we really are gathering people from the ends of the earth. We've talked about this before. And he may be tipping his hat to this idea. And they shall return to their lands of promise. Now, obviously, at the time, most of his audience probably isn't thinking about that. They're thinking, yeah, Assyria really feels like the ends of the earth at that point. It really feels far away. And for them to return to their lands of promise would be a really big deal. But this is where we're seeing this in our own time in a spiritual sense, people being gathered back to the land, kind of metaphorically speaking, of the house of Israel from the ends of the earth. And here it kind of turns everything on its head. It says that they'll return to their lands of promise, but that the land of the Lord shall be for servants and handmaids. And for, really, I might almost translate that as slaves, male and female slaves. but they shall take them captive unto whom they were captives, and they shall rule over their oppressors. So they'll be gathered into their lands of promise. They'll bring some good people with them that have joined to them when they were scattered. Which really, Jacob, the implication in the Book of Mormon of Jacob is that that's the reason for the scattering, actually, is that you can bring more people in at once, honestly, because of the scattering, which is really how it shakes out. But here he's saying that they'll bring these people in, and then Israel will do so well that it will rule over their oppressors. And really, I don't see this as having happened yet in a complete sense. You can see that it has kind of happened in smaller senses throughout Israel's history, but really this, in the complete sense that Isaiah is meaning here, I think doesn't happen for a long time. I think his audience may have assumed that Isaiah was talking about immediate events, and sometimes he is, but sometimes he's not. Sometimes he calls in things from the far future as a way, I think, of giving hope to people that wouldn't really have hope otherwise. He's saying, yes, someday things are going to be made right. He doesn't say when, doesn't mention that this is going to be maybe even at the end of the world. But it's enough for the people to know that someday things are going to be made right. And someday this is indeed going to happen. They will take them captives whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. We really are slowly seeing this happen as people rise out of poverty and oppression in various places and join the church and kind of rise up. A lot of the people in the early church were very, very poor, but now finally we're seeing that people are doing much better. Not quite ruling over their oppressors necessarily, but in some ways, kind of. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow and from thy fear and from the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve. So very clearly, once again, he's talking about these people being freed from slavery. And that finally they'll be able to rest. And the bondage that they are made to participate in during slavery, they won't have to worry about anymore. And when that happens, they will take up a proverb against the king of Babylon, saying, how hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. Now, this seems strange. Why is he talking about Babylon? Aren't we talking about the Assyrian captivity here? Well, the answer is yes, but also kind of yes and no. We're talking about the Assyrian captivity, but one of the big issues that we're also is coming up in this period is that Babylon has started to flex their muscles a little bit. That's something we talked about last time. Because at this time, the king of Babylon has actually broken away from the Assyrians. So at the end of this chapter, we realize that this whole sermon is given in the year King Ahaz dies. So that's 716 BC. And not too long before this, we actually find out that Babylon has kind of freed itself very, very temporarily from the Assyrians. In somewhere around 721 BC, this guy Marduk Apla Edina II, it's kind of a mouthful, conquers Babylon with the help of some Elamites, which are some guys slightly to the east. And so he becomes king in 721. And but he doesn't last very long. But in 716, he is indeed still the king. And Isaiah kind of is just making fun of him because he's so ridiculous. Have you ever heard of Marduk Apla Edina II? Yeah, no, most people haven't either. and so you can see that this guy was not incredibly successful as a king. We've heard of some of these other guys, maybe. Maybe you've heard of Sargon. You've probably heard of Nebuchadnezzar. Nobody's heard of this guy because he was not really that big of a deal. He thought he was great, but he really was not that big of a deal. By probably about 710, he has totally totally lost the throne. So yeah, remember that it goes backwards, right? Going from BC to AD, the history goes backwards. So if he's crowned king in 721, then he's no longer king by 710, so that's around 11 years between those periods of him becoming king and then not being king anymore. So really, he's kind of just a flash in the pan. But he thinks he's great, and Isaiah, once again, can't resist sort of calling him back to earth. But the relationship between the Assyrians and the Babylonians, therefore, in this chapter is a pretty strong relationship. So he is going to be kind of jumping back and forth. So he's saying that not only this is not going to be a problem, the Assyrians aren't going to really be a problem. Obviously, this little Babylonian kingdom that thinks it's all great is not going to be an issue either. And so he says, and it shall come to pass in that day that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say, How hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased? That this king, thinks he's all great, and he oppresses all these people around him. And Babylon is, this great, fantastic city, this golden city. But it seems amazing that it could ever end. But Isaiah says it indeed is going to end. How hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased? The Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked, the scepters of the rulers. Condemning these rulers for their wickedness and saying their scepter, the staff, the thing that signifies their rule, is going to be snapped in half by the Lord. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger, is persecuted, and none hindereth. This guy's been beating everybody up. He's been making enemies of all the people around him, and when he needs help most, nobody cares. Nobody cares. They're just happy that he's out of their hair now. And that's the thing that always happens with people like this, and I think that's part of Isaiah's point. These people who make, quote, friends, unquote, with their strong-arm tactics, suddenly realize they don't have any friends. They just have people that they've muscled into helping them. So when they're really in need, nobody cares about them. And in fact, it says, the whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Almost as soon as the dust has settled, practically, with this guy being taken out of office by force, aka killed, they break forth into singing. Everybody that's around breaks forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee, and also the cedars of Lebanon. So these are the other countries that were threatened, perhaps, by this mini Babylonian flash in the pan, if it became a big deal. Lebanon, probably literally Lebanon, but also fir trees, probably also that other area. He's used this image before of trees being symbolic of certain places. So there are actually really fertile places with a lot of trees in kind of part of Syria and then Lebanon. So he's probably talking about these regions who were most under threat if Babylon decided to get big. And they're happy because they don't have to deal with them. This kingdom ends up not being a big deal, and they say, since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. So they're free from the issues. They don't have to worry about this guy. So in other words, since you've died, no lumberjack, feller is the word for lumber, really should be translated lumberjack. No lumberjack has come up to cut us down, in other words. But then he paints this fantastic picture. So since he's not messing with these other countries, what is he doing? Well, he's paying a little visit to hell. Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. Really should be translated Sheol. That's their word for the kind of the place where the dead go. Kind of the Greek equivalent of Hades almost. So hell from beneath is excited to meet you. Everybody, it stirs up the dead for thee. It wakes up the dead. Even all the chief ones of the earth, all these dead kings. It has raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. So, in other words, hell's happy to meet you. All these people are waking up, and they're excited to see you when you come down to hell. And all they shall speak and say unto thee, Art thou become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? In other words, oh gee, we thought we were really great, and then we died and realized that we were just mortals. Looks like you're in the same boat, champ. Art thou become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave. The noise of thy viols is not heard. All your ego suddenly is worthless. All your feasts and all these great music you had in your feasts, you can't hear that anymore. You got worms underneath you and maggots on top of you. The worms spread under thee and the worms cover thee. Probably better translated, you've got maggots underneath you and worms on top of you. Welcome to your new kingdom. Aren't you excited? How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? And this should probably be, how art thou fallen from heaven, O bright and shining son of dawn. Bright and shining son of dawn is probably what that would be. However, the King James guys definitely were picking up what he was putting down. Translating as Lucifer is very good. Clearly, this is an allusion to the Book of Moses discussion about Satan falling from heaven. However, once again, not all of Isaiah's audience probably would have picked up on this. King James guys obviously do. They have the benefit of hindsight. Isaiah's audience might not have actually picked up on this. Some of them would have, obviously, those that were up on the Book of Moses. Those that hadn't been reading their scriptures lately probably would have just thought that this was another kind of exaggeration of Isaiah talking about this king. How art thou fallen from heaven, O bright and shining son of the dawn? Because he, kind of picturing him as a star sort of falling from heaven, that would have been very standard at the time. There was a lot of people who believed that these stars were sort of these deities and sort of divine beings, and so that fits just fine in the rest of the chapter. But then you realize, yeah, he probably is playing on that image, but he's also comparing him to Satan, who does exactly what he's saying the king does in this chapter. So he says, art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? You made everybody all afraid of you. You really, made the Gentiles kind of weaker. You really, by fighting against them. But now you're cut down to the ground, just like everybody else. For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. So this is him basically saying, I'm going to be like God, right? Ascend into heaven. Exalt my throne above the stars of God, right? So the stars of God are, like I said at the time, the sort of heavenly hosts, the heavenly armies, but also just these like heavenly beings that attend on God. So if you're above the stars of God, it means you're basically a deity, right? So I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. So there's a big mountain in Syria that was supposed to be, well, Syria, I use that loosely, in the northern Levant, in the area that is kind of Lebanon, Syria, northern Israel today. And it was supposed to be the home of the gods for the Canaanites. The mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. So that's what he's referring to here. He says, you're going to just be, not only ascend into heaven, you're going to go into heaven, past the stars of God, and then you're going to land yourself on top of the mountain where all the other gods sit, something akin to Mount Olympus in the Greek tradition, in the sides of the north. And that's what he's talking about. When it says sides of the north, that's this mountain. Okay, so I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So it's kind of this progression, not just ascend into heaven, not just be above the stars of God, not just be upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north, on this mountain where sort of Mount Olympus kind of a place. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, even above the top of the clouds. Now, a lot of times that's why they assigned these mountains as being the home of the gods, because they never saw the top, because there were always clouds. And so it was this idea that they, oh yeah, you can't see them, but they're up there, right? I will be like the Most High. So that's what, that he's going to replace the highest God. That's what he's thinking. And Isaiah's kind of clearly making fun of him for this. Hey, you thought you were going to replace the highest God. Well, you're just a mortal. You make just as good worm food as everybody else does, right? Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell. So you think you're going to go way up high? The exact opposite is going to be the case. Thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. You thought you were going to be on the sides of the north, on the mount of the gods. You're going to be on the sides of the pit of hell. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee. It's like stare at you, almost like stare at you in disbelief is the implication. They'll stare at you in disbelief, and shall consider thee, and shall say, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, and made the world as a wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof, and opened not the house of the prisoners? Almost like they can't believe it. You're worm food just like us. You made the earth tremble, you shook kingdoms, you wiped everything out, destroyed all these cities, you didn't let your prisoners go? Seems kind of amazing, because now you're just like us. Once again, these are these kings, these dead kings talking to him, right? All the kings of the nations, all the kings of the Gentiles, I think I might say there, yea, all of them lie in glory, every one of them in his own house or in his own tomb. So all of the kings of the nations lie in state. But not you, right? When the Assyrians come in, they're pretty brutal. And this is prophecy that I think may refer specifically to the king, although it may also refer to the nation probably as a whole, and some things later on will point that out. But it says, But thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch. That's pretty bad. At least the bodies of all these other kings are at least lying in state. Not you. You're cast out of your grave like an abominable branch. All the implication here almost is like they're taking out the body and desecrating it. Now, I don't know if that actually happened to this king. I don't think we have good enough records to know if it did. But the idea is that this definitely happens. If it doesn't happen to this king specifically, it does happen to Babylon as a whole in a symbolic sense. And I think that's what Isaiah is gunning for this entire chapter, is not just this king, it's the arrogance of this little kingdom as a whole. And thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch, and the remnant of those that are slain thrust through with a sword, to go down to the stones of the pit as a carcass trodden under feet. Yeah, I mean that's pretty bad. It's like an abominable branch. I mean, when you're trimming in olive vineyards or grape vineyards, if you have a branch that you don't want, you just throw it away and burn it, right? And I think that's what he's going for here. Everyone else is lying in state. You're going to be taken out of your tomb and thrown away. And it says, like an abominable branch and the remnant of those that are slain. Just this is kind of grisly, but probably accurate. Sometimes they used to reuse tombs, so they, especially if you had an army coming in, they needed to bury people. We actually see this in other parts of the Old Testament. But if you have an army coming in, they need to bury a bunch of people. They'll just toss bodies of people of other nationalities. They'll just toss them out. So literally the remnant of those that are slain, what's left of the dead, tossed out of their graves so that somebody else can use this tomb, right? Kind of grisly, but I think that's the image here. And that probably is exactly what happened to him. But also, like I said, symbolically, this is what's happening to Babylon. Everything that they know is kind of being destroyed when the Assyrians come in. All of their past is kind of being wiped out in much the same way, almost like this dead body being desecrated. Okay. Like an abominable branch and the remnant of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stones of the pit as a carcass trodden underfoot. Once again, that strengthens this image. By the way, we only get that from the Book of Mormon. In the King James and in the Masoretic text, it's very unclear. But this is one unified image, that you take this stuff, usually stuff that's thrown away, like the abominable branch, and stuff that is pulled out of the grave and scattered in the streets, and people are just running over this dead body because somebody else has pulled the body out so they can use the tomb again. Kind of a grisly image, but that seems to be what he's talking about here. Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial. Once again, not a normal burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. So You're not laid in state. Why? Because you don't even have anybody to make sure that your burial place stays undisturbed. Um, you've destroyed your land and slain your own people. So how did you think? You thought your seed, your children, were going to survive? No, prepare slaughter for his children for the iniquities of their fathers, that they do not rise nor possess the land nor fill the face of the world with cities. Now that's not him recommending that children be killed for their father's sins. It's just saying, in this case, this is what's going to happen. Their father was so bad that all their kids are going to die. And once again, that happens. The Assyrians, when they come in, they don't save royal families. They kill everybody. And certainly, I would say that's what we're looking at here, almost definitely. Slaughter for his children for the iniquity of their fathers. This king was so bad, nobody's going to defend him. All his children that try to hide get turned over to the enemy, and they all get killed. So they don't rise, they don't possess the land, they don't fill the face of the world with cities. Yeah, I mean that's quite the condemnation. It says, "For I will raise up against them, saith the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name and remnant, the son and nephew, saith the Lord." So really, he's just going to destroy everything, right? Like I said, people don't, when other nations come in, they don't like to leave kings from the last dynasty around. They kill everybody. Anybody that has any kind of claim to the throne dies. So the name itself, anybody that has any kind of association with the family, but also any extended family, even nephews, right? Everybody dies. So that's really kind of a miserable judgment against these people. But that's what happens. And so this guy thinks he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, God says, nope, you're worm food, just like everybody else. And then he goes on to say, "I will also make it a possession for the bittern and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the besom of destruction, saith the Lord of hosts." If you're like me, you were 0 for 2 for the odd words in that verse. I love the King James. Sometimes it uses some really old words. I'll also make it a possession for the bittern. That's probably hedgehog. Make it a possession for the hedgehog, and pools of water will be there. In other words, it's going to revert to a sort of swamp-like state, and it's just going to have little hedgehogs and pools of water there. I will sweep it with the besom of destruction, probably more like the broom. I'll sweep it with the broom of destruction, saith the Lord of hosts. So in other words, it's going to be this totally empty place full of hedgehogs and swamp, and he's going to wipe it off the face of the earth. I think that's really the implication. And once again, he says, refers to himself as the Lord of hosts, refers to the Lord as the Lord of hosts, he who causes armies to be, right? So you know that he can bring it to pass because he has the hosts of heaven at his disposal. So now I would just like, he kind of shifts mode here, but before we get to that in 24, I would like to just run through all of this again, starting in 7, just so you can get the arc. Now that you know the details, you can kind of get the arc. So it says, "The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee, and also the cedars of Lebanon, saying, Since thou art laid down, no fellow is come up against us. Help from beneath is moved for to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kingdoms of the nations. All they shall speak and say unto thee, Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, the noise of thy vials is not heard. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Art thou cut to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For thou said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and shall consider thee, and shall say, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, and made the world as a wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof, and opened not the house of the prisoners? All the kings of the nations, yea, all of them lie in glory, every one of them in his own house. But thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch, and the remnant of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword. They go down to the stones of the pit as a carcass trodden under feet. Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. Prepare slaughter for his children for the iniquities of their fathers, that they do not rise nor possess the land, nor fill the face of the world with cities. For I will rise up against them, saith the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name and remnant and son and nephew, saith the Lord. I will also make it a possession for the bittern and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the besom of destruction, saith the Lord of hosts. So that there, we kind of talked about details, but I wanted you to kind of get the whole arc of that. You can see how, even though it feels choppy, I wanted to emphasize to you that this is one long arc of him kind of making one point. He draws in lots of details, but he kind of brings it to one main point, and that is that even though this guy thought he was the best thing ever, he's going to die just like everybody else. And of course, I think the implication is, yeah, he's talking about this other kingdom, but I think it would be very easy for him to talk negatively about other kingdoms, but really be referring to his own time. I think that this is the year that King Ahaz dies. What does that mean? This is the year Hezekiah becomes king. I think this is a swift kick in the pants to Hezekiah as he begins his sort of career, if you will, as king, to remind him, by the way, Hezekiah, you should not become arrogant, because you are just worm food too. So yes, ostensibly this is about the king of Babylon, and definitely it is, but the king's listening. I think he's picking up what Isaiah's putting down, and I think he takes the message to heart. Hezekiah is one of the best kings that we get in the entire Old Testament. So I think Isaiah, yeah, he's talking about the king of Babylon, but I think Hezekiah takes this message to heart and grasps his own mortality and acts accordingly. And when I just read the whole thing there, I think you can see that that's definitely, I think, one of the big take-home messages here. So then he concludes this part of it by talking about the Assyrians. It says, the Lord of hosts hath sworn, saying, surely as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will bring the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him under foot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. This is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out upon all nations. For the Lord of hosts hath purposed, and who shall disannul? And his hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back? In the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. So there in 24 through 27, and his hand stretched out, who shall stretch it back? That's the end of this, and he's talking about Babylon isn't going to make it, but the Assyrians aren't going to make it either. This is also something that's going to happen in the future. And so he also brings it up to just remind them, yeah, Babylon's not going to make it, but Assyria isn't going to either. Now, Babylon will return, of course, but the Assyrians are going to be broken by the Lord, and that is exactly what happens later. And then you get an editorial note. A lot of the stuff in Isaiah, obviously, is by Isaiah, but periodically you get editorial notes, and 28 is probably one of those. In the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. So it actually is the end of this speech, and it gives you the date for the end of this for this speech. So at the very beginning of chapter 13, we get the heading, the introduction to it, to what it is, and to exactly what's going to go on in the sermon. And then right there at the end, that's the end of the speech. The year that King Ahaz died was this burden. That's the conclusion to the speech. Just kind of a little note written at the end. Now we just throw everything into the text. We don't separate it into kind of introduction pieces and conclusion notes and stuff like that. And actually, they formatted the Book of Mormon recently to make it easier to see what notes are things like this, original editorial notes to the text and things compared to things that were added later. If I remember correctly, they italicized everything that was later notes and then left everything in regular text that was original to the text. But if we're even having a difficult time knowing what is original and what is later editorial notes in the Book of Mormon, you can imagine how difficult it is in Isaiah. But I think it's very clear that verse 1 of 13 and verse 28 here verse 1 of 13 and verse 28 here of 24 are kind of introduction note and conclusion note to the sermon, which is everything else in the middle. So that's kind of boring, I guess, but it does help you to realize that the way that it's organized, which is important. Because that phrase seems odd otherwise. If you assume there's continuity between 27 through 29 to 32 to the end of the chapter, and then there's this weird, in the year that King Ahaz died, there was this burden, you go, wait, what just happened, right? And then why Palestina? What's going on? Well, that's the end of the sermon, and then you have a 4-verse note after that little tiny footnote at the end of the sermon. But let's just talk about this. So he's talking about the destruction of Babylon. He starts with Assyria, actually, in this chapter about the Assyrian captivity. Then he jumps to Babylon, and then he jumps back to Assyria. And I think, once again, it's just that he wants to make the same points about them, that the Assyrians aren't going to last forever, and eventually people are going to be released from that burden. The Babylonians aren't going to last forever, and people are eventually going to be released from that burden. And so I think that's what we see here. He's trying to comfort these people and help them to realize that everything is indeed going to be all right. And he says that the Lord of hosts has sworn, absolutely, surely as I have thought, so it shall come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand. In other words, nothing can stand in its way. That I will bring the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him underfoot. This is actually much better in the Book of Mormon. It doesn't make any sense, really, in the King James. Once again, Book of Mormon comes through for us. I will bring the Assyrian in my land. So he's going to actually call in the Assyrians upon Judah to humble them. But then, upon my mountains, he will tread him underfoot. So he's going to bring the Assyrians in to humble Judah, and as soon as they've been humbled, he's going to immediately humble the Assyrians by killing a huge part of their army. Once again, we talked about this early on, but that is exactly what happens. He kills a huge part of the army. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. So this is the Babylon. I think the Assyrians aren't going to be a burden to Babylon anymore, but they're not going to be a burden to Israel either. But once again, this is all about Babylon. So I think that this is talking about the Assyrians. He's going to break them. He's going to bring them into his own land, break them, and that's going to relieve the burden that's on the shoulders of Babylon because of the Assyrians, right? Because when the Assyrians come in to Babylon, they destroy everything, but then God in turn will destroy the Assyrians. And this is happening, this sermon is given when King Ahaz dies. When God destroys the Assyrian army, it's not that much farther into the future. So this is also going to happen fairly soon. And so really, that's exactly what happens. This is the purpose that's purposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out upon all nations. So once again, I think he's saying he knows exactly what he's doing. I have a plan for the whole earth. That I want all burdens to be broken off of all shoulders. And this is the hand that is stretched out upon all nations to make sure it happens. Once again, the hand is stretched out, and this is a sense of sort of violence. He's making sure this is happening. He's going to smack them around until they wake up and figure things out. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who shall disannul? If God wants to do it, if the Lord of hosts has made this plan, nobody's going to keep him from doing it. His hand is stretched out. Who's strong enough to fight him? Nobody. Right? So I think that he's saying that, yes, the Assyrians are going to humble the Babylonians, and then God is going to break the Assyrians like a twig, and then the Babylonians are not going to be under the Assyrian yoke anymore. And of course, that's exactly what happens. And as soon as they become not under the Assyrian yoke anymore, they become an issue themselves, and they come in and they destroy the temple. They destroy the temple in Jerusalem, and finally bring about what we call the Babylonian captivity, but that's much, much later. And so that's the end of that sermon there. Beginning of 13 through verse 27 of 14, and then the end note, in the year that King Ahaz died, was this burden. Now there's another little note, maybe a short sermon, maybe he started the sermon, didn't finish, I don't know what this is. It's a little piece of something else, that they lost most of it, but they had this piece, so they stuck it in at the end. It's very old, it's in the Book of Mormon, so we know it's probably from, it's got to be from Isaiah's time. We don't know when, though. But it does seem to be talking about the issues involving the end of the Babylonian Empire, maybe, or maybe the Assyrians. Anyway, it's very difficult to tell because we have so little of it. But thematically it's similar, so I'll just read it to you. You'll be able to tell that. Rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. And the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety. And I will kill thy root with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant. Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Palestina art dissolved. There shall come forth from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. What shall then answer the messengers of the nations? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. So with these few verses, it's hard to tell exactly, like I said, when they were written. Is this a piece of something longer? Is it just a really short thing that Isaiah said against the Philistines, just like a very longer version of one we had earlier against the Babylonians? It's hard to say. It could be that this actually happens at the same time as the one above. It's difficult to know if that note, in the year that King Ahaz died, was this burden, is this 4-verse burden, this 4-verse oracle, or the really long one above it. So yeah, it's difficult to say. This may have taken place. That note may refer to this one, and so it might have taken place at the time of the death of King Ahaz. It's very possible that both of these happened at the same time, and that might make sense. So he might be saying, Rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. In other words, King Ahaz, who's always all the kings are kind of giving the Philistines trouble, don't rejoice because he's dead, right? For out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice. So you thought Ahaz is bad, Hezekiah's going to be even worse. And his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. And actually, Hezekiah does do a lot of damage to the Philistines in his lifetime, if I remember correctly. And actually, I think we'll talk about this later. Hezekiah definitely does some damage, and so for him to be Isaiah to say that would be fairly apt. You thought Ahaz was bad, Hezekiah's going to be really bad. Because this might be an issue of emissaries coming to talk to the king, the new king, Hezekiah, and Hezekiah maybe is asking Isaiah, well, what should I say? And Isaiah says this, right? That would explain why it was so short, and we can see that maybe in verse 32. It says, Rejoice not, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. So Palestina is Philistia. That's what that is. The area where the Philistines live. Okay, so this is a burden, an oracle against the Philistines. Rejoice not, thou Philistines, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent you shall come forth like a cockatrice. Cockatrice is like an adder, maybe, and the other maybe is a serpent, is maybe a viper. So one snake that is kind of poisonous is going to give way to an even more poisonous snake, and it's going to be like a flying dragon, whose bites are poisonous, like instantly fatal. That's kind of the progression, it seems like, here. you'll have the serpent, but then you'll have the cockatrice, and then you'll have the fiery flying serpent. So this idea of progression of kings kind of sort of continuously being worse and worse to the Philistines, which is just about right. You have first you have Ahaz, who ruffles with the Philistines a little bit, but then you have Hezekiah, who definitely does, and then obviously after him, the next ones are the Assyrians, who definitely give the Philistines trouble. And the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety. So, in other words, the firstborn of the poor shall feed. This is probably in Israel. In other words, Israel's not going to have to worry about the Philistines anymore. Even the needy shall lie down in safety. People that usually can't get any kind of defenses from Philistine raids aren't going to have to worry about it, because I will kill thy root with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant. All of you are going to die, and Israel is going to be safe. And famine, a lot of times famine is associated with warfare, because of sieges that happen, so people can't get any food, and so they end up dying. That may be what we're looking at here with the Assyrians. What the Assyrians would do to the Philistines. Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Palestina, whole Philistia, art dissolved. So, all these are little separate city-states. They're not like one big unified kind of nation. They're little Philistine city-states. So he says, cry, cities, because you're dissolved. You're all that's left. There's not even any remnant of unity left between you. Because there shall come from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. He's painting the image of an army here. It looks like smoke when an army's on the move, right? Because they're stirring up all this dust. And it says, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. It's probably their ranks will be perfect. Even while they're running, generating all this dust that it looks like a smoke cloud, they will all keep ranks perfectly. Kind of this terrifying image, actually. And this actually still happens, even fairly recently. People on the eve of the German invasion of Russia during World War II said that they could see the smoke cloud from the tanks and the jeeps and trucks and everything, or for the tanks and the trucks from a long ways away. They could actually see the smoke rising up. So kind of fantastic. This isn't probably not smoke. This is the dust that they're stirring up, but it looks like this cloud rolling towards them. Kind of a fantastic image. It says, what shall then answer the messengers of the nations? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. So it could be the Philistines have come, as King Ahaz has died, the Philistines have come to Hezekiah and said, hey, we want a treaty. We know that this happens sometimes. King David sends emissaries to the son of a king when that king dies, to try to establish relations. So that may have been a sort of a custom for your neighbors to visit you when your dad dies, and try to make sure that you're maintaining similar ties, or try to improve ties. So it could be Philistines have come, they tried to negotiate, and Isaiah tells King Hezekiah what to say to him. Basically, I'm going to be worse than my dad ever was. You guys are going to have a tough time with me, because not only are you going to have a tough time with me, the Assyrians are going to give you a tough time too. So, what shall then answer the messengers of the nations? What shall we say to the messengers of the Philistines that have come? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it, not you. The Lord has established Zion, the temple, right? We will trust that God on his temple in Jerusalem will save us. The poor of his people will trust in it. We're not going to trust you to save us. We're not going to ally with you against the Assyrians. We're not going to be buddies with you. We're going to trust in the Lord to save us. And this bodes well for King Hezekiah's reign. This is going to be his MO throughout his reign. He's sometimes, in moments of weakness, tries to get help from foreign powers. And Isaiah kind of smacks some sense into him and reminds him that he shouldn't be worrying about this. God is going to protect them. And Now, it's very interesting that this is the way the large chunks of Isaiah quotations in the Book of Mormon end. Kind of interesting, once again talking about the Assyrian captivity. But ends with this phrase, and this may be why they end it here, partially because they can't really proceed to Moab. Moab has little to do with what they're dealing with in the Book of Mormon. But it says, "What shall then answer the messengers of the nations? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it." These guys are out in the middle of nowhere, the Nephites, at this point, 2nd Nephi. They're out in the middle of nowhere in this new continent. They're just trying to get started. They don't really know what to do. But they know that they can trust the Lord. The Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. And I think that's very apt, and that's what they end up doing. And that, in some ways, is the foundation of their entire kingdom. They trust in the Lord, and they end up being all right. And I think that's really what a lot of this all has been about. Don't trust in your own strength, because at the end of the day, we're all just hurtling towards the grave. It's kind of a grim way of looking at it, but that's, I think, what Isaiah is saying in this chapter. Everybody's going to die, and when you die, you become fertilizer. You need to accept that and realize that God is the only one that can save you. And I think that that's part of why they bring this up in the Book of Mormon, because they really are isolated from everything, and they need to realize that their only support now is going to be God. And I think really that's what this chapter is really talking about. Don't rely on everything else that you might rely on. Just rely on God, and He will help you. So anyway, that's 2nd Nephi 24. It's the end of the big Isaiah chunk in the Book of Mormon, and we'll get to some other stuff later, but congratulations, you've made it through the big chunk of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, and we will see you guys next time.